Nightmare Neighbor. The old, tall apartment building stood under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was late, and most of the windows were dark. Rena stood outside the building, staring up at the second floor where her apartment was. She had lived here for a few months, and the place had always been quiet. Until Arthur moved in next door. Rena's apartment was at the end of the hallway on the second floor, and the trip to take out the trash usually took only a few minutes. But tonight, she felt eyes on her. As she was about to turn the corner at the end of the hall, there he was. Arthur was standing by his door, as if waiting for her. He always found a reason to talk and stand too close to her. She kept her head down, mumbled a quick greeting, and brushed past him toward the stairs. This time, he said nothing. A chill ran down Rena's spine. Something was different tonight, something that made her more uneasy than before. Rena stepped into her apartment and quickly shut the door. She took a moment to calm herself, telling herself she was overreacting. She turned off the lights in the living room, planning to head to bed and watch some TV. It was late, and she was tired but not quite ready to sleep. As she passed the broom closet, she heard something, a faint sound, like a rustling from inside. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, staring at the closet door. With trembling hands, she reached for the closet handle. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her not to open it, but she had to. She couldn't just leave it. She pulled the door open. Arthur was standing there, in her closet. For a split second, time seemed to stop. He was just standing there, staring at her, unblinking, with a twisted smile on his face. She gasped, stumbling backward. Her heart raced as panic rose inside her. He stepped forward, crawling out of the closet like a predator closing in on its prey. She ran into the bedroom, slamming the door shut, but she didn't have time to lock it. The door flew open, and Arthur was right there, his face wild. She dashed for the bathroom, her final place of refuge. She slammed the door just as Arthur reached the bedroom. Her hands fumbled with the lock. Rena pressed her back against the cold bathroom wall. Her breath came in sharp gasps as Arthur pounded on the door, trying to break through. The thin wooden door was all that separated her from the man who had been stalking her for weeks. His sick grin etched into her mind. Thankfully, she had brought her phone with her. She gripped it tightly, her fingers trembling as she spoke to the police. Her voice was barely a whisper, fear choking her words. Arthur slammed the door again, the wood splintering under the force. Rena knew it wouldn't hold much longer. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. She held her breath, pressing her ear to the door, straining to hear any sound. Was he gone? Had he given up? Arthur stood outside the bathroom door, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild with anticipation. His patience was wearing thin. His hand hovered over the doorknob before he stepped back, glancing at Rena's bedroom. He knew she was cornered, with nowhere to go. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, shiny knife. His fingers tightened around the handle, and his eyes narrowed. With a single powerful kick, the bathroom door splintered apart. The door burst open, and Arthur lunged inside, his eyes wide and feral. She backed up until she was almost against the wall. She screamed for him to stay away, but Arthur didn't stop. He lunged at her, grabbing her arm in a grip so tight it would leave bruises. Rena tried to pull away, but he was too strong. Pain shot down her spine as he twisted her wrist, pinning it to the wall. Her phone slipped from her hand, crashing to the floor. Arthur's face was now only a few centimeters from hers, whispering threats because she always ignored him in the hallway. Rena struggled, trying to break free, but he pulled her closer, tightening his grip. His knife slashed through the air, grazing her arm. She gasped as a sharp pain cut through her skin, blood trickling down. The sound of sirens tore through the night, growing louder as the police raced toward the apartment building. Flashing lights reflected off the windows like a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. Inside, Rena's vision blurred with panic and pain. He shoved her against the wall again, laughing maniacally as he brought the knife closer to her throat. Her body screamed for escape. Her free hand groped blindly along the counter near the sink, desperately searching for anything she could use to defend herself. She grabbed a glass soap bottle and, without thinking, smashed it over Arthur's head. The glass shattered, and he staggered back, momentarily dazed. Arthur staggered. The knife slipped from his hand and fell to the floor. Rena did not wait. She rushed out the door, holding her throbbing arm that was bleeding from the cut he made. She ran out of the bathroom and into the living room, her mind screaming for escape. But Arthur wasn't far behind. Stunned, but enraged, he grabbed the knife again and charged toward her, blood streaming down his face from where the glass had struck him. The police burst through the front door of the apartment complex, racing up the stairs to the second floor. They knew they had to act quickly. Rena reached the living room, but her legs buckled beneath her, sending her crashing to the floor. She could feel Arthur's looming presence, approaching with the knife in hand. His eyes were now filled with rage, the twisted delight gone. He reached for her, grabbing her hair. Rena winced in pain, trying to get up, her body screaming for help. Arthur growled, his voice low and venomous. "There's nowhere left to run, girl." Just as he raised the knife again, the apartment door burst open with a loud crash. The police swarmed into the apartment, guns drawn. "Drop the weapon," one of them shouted, their voices slicing through the tension. Arthur hesitated, giving Rena the opening she needed. She kicked his leg hard, causing him to cry out in pain. She ran toward the police, gasping for breath, blood dripping from her arm. But the nightmare was finally over. Rena sat on the edge of the ambulance, her mind still reeling, her body in shock. She watched as the police loaded Arthur into the back of their car. The flashing lights of the police car faded into the night as they drove away. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in the faint glow of streetlights. It was 2 a.m. The store was closed, and the eerie quiet surrounded it. The night was still, until a soft tapping on the glass echoed in the darkness. I was the night shift manager here. Usually, things were calm, and nothing happened. It was just me, stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the outside world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken when I heard the faint tapping. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart and headed toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him, a man. He was leaning against the glass, trying to peer inside. His clothes were tattered, his face expressionless, with a hollow, vacant look in his eyes. He saw me the moment I came into view. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was emotionless, no hint of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and that he couldn't be here. As I turned to walk away, a loud bang startled me. The man's fists were pounding on the glass, over and over, each strike louder and angrier than the last. My heart raced. This guy wasn't just a harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, showing him I was ready to call the police. Only then did he back off, his eyes still locked on me, filled with rage. Slowly, he stepped back into the shadows of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to focus back on my work. 15 minutes passed. The tapping, The pounding, the man, all of it faded from my mind as I immersed myself in stocking the shelves. But then I heard it, the sound of metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned the stroller and ran forward, fear rising. My heart sank when I saw the glass door slightly open. The lock, the only thing that kept the door secure, was missing. Fear gripped me as I realized what this meant. I need to go to the office, call the police now. I turned to run for the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was the man. His expression hadn't changed, still cold, still lifeless, filled with rage. I don't think anything. I just run. I burst through the door, the man right behind me. Suddenly, a beat-up van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved dangerously, nearly hitting me as it stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything flipped upside down. A sharp pain suddenly exploded at the back of my head. My body lurched forward as I fell to the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before the world started fading. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold pavement. My vision blurred, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the van's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up with a throbbing headache, my wrists tightly bound behind me. The van bounced and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then it all came rushing back. I started to string it together. Man, the truck. Perhaps I was kidnapped by him. My heart raced as I realized I needed to act, and fast. I glanced around. Inside, it was pitch black, but I could make out a pile of old tools, a rusted toolbox, and some scattered metal pieces on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I could hear the driver muttering to himself up front. His voice was low, angry. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the panic rising inside me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I inched closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was hard, but I found a small, jagged piece of rusted metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, rubbing the metal against the ropes. My heart pounded with every noise the van made, every bump in the road that might expose me, each one painful enough to make me want to scream. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scratches and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced toward the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake yet. I noticed the door latch wasn't locked. I needed a plan. The van slowed as it made a sharp turn onto a dirt road. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the back door open and jumped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my body as I tumbled over dirt and gravel. For a second, I thought I wouldn't be able to move, but adrenaline surged through me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the trees. Behind me, the van screeched to a stop. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees, the branches, scratched at my skin as I tore through the dense underbrush. My mind was foggy, teetering between fear and survival. I could hear the man crashing through the forest behind me, his breath heavy and furious. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could get there fast, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, waving my arms frantically as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed against the hood, gasping for breath. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to answer. All I could do was whisper, "Help me." The driver pulled out his phone, calling the police. I glanced back at the man. He stood at the edge of the woods, staring at me with cold, furious eyes. But he didn't come any closer. He knew it was over. The flashing lights of police cars lit up the dark road. Officers surrounded the van. The man already in handcuffs not far away. His face was cold, blank, disturbingly empty. I sat on the curb, still trembling, wrapped in a blanket the police had given me. The world felt strange, like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. But I was grateful, lucky to be alive. I was free. The police assured me that he'd be locked away, that he wouldn't hurt anyone else. But the thought still lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I stood by the car, watching the police take the man away. The fear was still there, clinging to the edges of my mind, but I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to survive the night shift. The clown in the tree. This happened to me when I was 14. It was the same year everyone was talking about creepy clowns lurking in random places. The stories were everywhere, but I never took them seriously until I had an encounter of my own. I was sitting alone in the living room. My parents had gone to my grandparents' house for the evening, leaving me home by myself. But instead of feeling free, there was a strange unease I couldn't shake. I texted some friends, inviting them over to kill time John and Emma. We played video games for a while, but after a few hours, we got bored. John had an idea. He said, "Let's go into the woods." There was a forest right behind my house that we usually avoided, especially at night. But it was still light out, and with nothing else to do, I agreed. We gathered ourselves and headed out. Part of me regretted it as soon as we left the house. The forest was dense, tall trees casting cool shade, but we weren't scared. We joked around, tossed sticks, and laughed about nothing. We had been there for about 20 or 30 minutes when we heard something strange. Someone was crying. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like sobbing, desperate, coming from deep within the trees. We all stopped, staring at each other. John was the first to break the silence, whispering tensely, "What the hell is that?" None of us knew, and Emma suggested we go check it out. I wanted to say no, but before I could, everyone was already heading towards the sound. My heart started pounding harder with each step. Something felt wrong, like we were walking into a place we shouldn't. As we got closer, we saw a figure slumped on a large branch of an old tree. It was a man, dressed as a clown. His outfit was white with black polka dots, but it was stained and torn. He wore a black wig, but it was messy, and his makeup was smeared by what looked like tears. He just sat there, quietly crying. John, being the idiot he was, yelled, "Hey, you idiot! Why are you crying up there?" A chill ran down my spine, and I instantly turned to John, telling him to shut up. But it was too late. The clown looked down at us, his tear-streaked face twisting into a smile. His lips curled upward, but it was hollow, as if he was trying to express something through invisible pain. And then I saw it. His hand, gripping a large machete, the blade covered in what looked like blood. We were frozen. He just sat there, staring at us, his smile widening grotesquely, yet his eyes were cold, emotionless. He said, "You won't understand, but when I show you, you will." Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I screamed, "Run!" We we scattered, running in all directions. My heart pounded, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted towards home. The forest seemed endless, branches scratching at my skin as I ran. I could hear the others screaming, their voices fading as we were separated. I reached the edge of the woods, sprinting into my backyard. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door behind me. Then, I waited for my friends. Emma made it back, panting and pale with fear. But John wasn't with us. We waited for him, hoping he'd burst through the door, laughing about how scared we were. But then we waited, and no one came. We called the police. They came and searched the forest. We told them everything: the clown, the machete, the crying. They didn't seem surprised. It turned out the man we saw was a local. He had been on the run for days. The police said he was a heavy drug user who had killed his wife and left her body wrapped in a white sheet. The next day, they found John. He was dead, discovered in a deep lake in the forest. The man must have chased him while the rest of us ran. I couldn't believe it. John was gone, just like that. And it was my fault for agreeing to go into that forest. If I hadn't, maybe he would still be alive. I told my parents everything, and they promised never to leave me home alone again. But it didn't help much. I couldn't sleep for weeks, and when I did, I had nightmares of the clown standing in the forest, smiling at me with his blood-stained machete. It's been 5 years since that night. I'm 19 now, but the memory of what happened in the forest is still burned into my mind. John's disappearance and the discovery of his body in the lake. It haunts me. No one ever talked about it after the police closed the case. A tragic accident, they said. A drug-crazed maniac. But I knew there was more to it. For years, I pushed the memories down, but recently, they've started to resurface. It began with nightmares, the image of the clown, his twisted smile. But lately, it's been more real, as if he's not just in my dreams anymore. Something is coming for me. I've started feeling like I'm being watched again, just like back then. And tonight, I swear I saw him, standing at the edge of the forest behind my house, staring at me. I grabbed a flashlight, pepper spray, and a taser. I don't even know what I was thinking, but I couldn't sit here, paralyzed by fear anymore. The only way to end this is to go back to where it all started. The air was thick with silence as I stepped outside, the flashlight casting weak beams through the trees. The moment I entered the forest, each step felt heavier than the last, as if the woods themselves were pulling me deeper into the darkness. I didn't know where I was going, but my legs seemed to remember the way. Soon enough, I found myself back at the place where we had first seen the clown crying. Suddenly, the rustling of leaves shattered the silence. I froze. The sound of snapping twigs grew closer. I slowly turned around. The flashlight shook in my trembling hands, illuminating a figure perched on a branch, whistling. It was him. He looked just like before, his white clothes smeared with dirt and something darker dried blood. His black wig was still a tangled mess. He just sat there, staring, holding the machete. The clown tilted his head, his smile twisting even more as he jumped down effortlessly, walking slowly, deliberately toward me. He said, "Welcome back." I was so angry I almost cried, yelling that I knew what he had done to John. The clown's smile faded, replaced by a fake look of pity. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I didn't kill him. He chose it." I shook my head, backing away. His words. When I ran, I remembered seeing John hesitate, standing still. He didn't seem scared, more like mesmerized. And what he said before we ran into the woods, he looked sad, doesn't he? I snapped back to reality as the clown got closer, saying that when it was my turn, I'd understand. His words hit me like a punch. I stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen branch. The flashlight slipped from my hand, flickering as it rolled across the ground. Darkness enveloped me, and I reached to grab it, but the clown's footsteps were closer now. I looked up and saw him towering over me, raising the machete. I pulled the pepper spray from my pocket and sprayed it. He staggered for a moment. But then I heard a voice that sounded like John's. "Alex, you need to leave." I don't know how. I didn't look back at the clown. I just ran. His laughter echoed behind me. Suddenly, I was standing in my backyard, alone. The forest was quiet now, the house dark and still. I rushed inside and called the police, convinced he was still out there. When the police arrived this time, he was there. They found him crouched near the lake, clutching the machete. His clothes were soaked in blood and dirt. He didn't resist when they approached. Later, they interrogated him for hours. The clown believed he was chosen to lead people to the other side. The police dismissed it as the ramblings of a madman. But even then, I knew something darker was at play. Horrible night train ride. It was a cold autumn evening, and the train station was nearly deserted. The dim streetlights flickered in the distance as I hurried through the empty streets. I had walked for 30 minutes from my university and was about to catch the 9 p.m. train. I ran to the platform just in time as the train stopped in front of me. I stepped inside, glancing at the empty train cars. It was always quiet at this hour of the night, with only a few passengers. I found an empty seat by the window and sat down. I opened my notebook to review my lecture notes. The train gently rumbled as it pulled away from the station. The rhythmic clattering of the wheels on the tracks was soothing, almost enough to drown out the unease gnawing at me. I looked around the train car and was surprised to see another passenger. A girl was sitting a few rows away, her head bowed, her face hidden by long, dark hair. I hadn't noticed her when I first boarded. She didn't move, just sat there, completely still. Something about her posture made me uneasy. She was hunched over as if staring intently at something at her feet, but I couldn't see what. I tried to focus on my notes, but my mind kept drifting back to her. She had been sitting still for a long time. The longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. Suddenly, I heard a faint rustling sound. I looked up. She was no longer in her seat. Now she was right in front of me. I found it strange because I hadn't seen her move at all. A moment ago, she had been several rows away, and now here she was, her pale face directly in front of me. Her skin was almost ghostly white, and her eyes were wide, black, and empty, staring at me without blinking. Then she smiled, a smile that made me jump in fear. She began to speak, her voice soft, whispery, and strange. She greeted me and introduced herself as Jan. She then asked for my name. For a moment, my throat went dry, and I couldn't speak. I hesitated, stammering my name. Her smile grew wider, and she tilted her head slightly as if studying me.
Nice to meet you, T.
Her eyes never blinked, just stared straight into me. I felt a bit uncomfortable, but I tried to remain calm. I told myself she was just a strange student, maybe someone a little socially awkward. After an awkward silence, she finally spoke. She asked me if I had noticed anything strange and why this train was so empty. Then, with a curious tone, she asked if I had heard the rumors. My heart skipped a beat. She leaned closer, whispering,
People have gone missing on this train. Everyone at school knows about it. That's why I usually don't take this train. But tonight, I had no choice.
Her words sent chills down my spine. I hadn't heard any rumors, but the way she said it, the intensity in her eyes, it gave me goosebumps. I forced a smile, trying to break the tension. I had never heard that story before. I glanced around the empty train car. The train kept moving, the world outside darkening. Suddenly, Jan's expression changed. She froze, her eyes wide as she whispered, trembling, asking if I could hear something. I frowned, straining my ears to listen. I listened harder, but all I could hear was the sound of the train on the tracks and the engine. Her eyes were fixed on the window, her face creased with fear.
It's getting louder,
She said.
Listen carefully.
I just wanted to ignore her, to dismiss whatever she was saying. Then, I saw it. A shadowy figure, flickering in and out of view, running alongside the train, its limbs long and distorted. It moved unnaturally fast. I asked what it was, but she didn't answer, her face pale with fear. She whispered,
It's coming.
The train shook. The lights flickered for a moment. I jumped, gripping the edge of my seat. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, Jan was gone. I blinked, my mind reeling. How could she have disappeared like that? I stood up, looking around the car, but there was no sign of her. The train began to slow down. The door slid open, and a thick darkness enveloped me. I couldn't see anything. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, my breath visible in the cold air. And then I felt it, a cold hand gripping my shoulder. Horrible night train ride. From behind, I felt an icy hand gripping tightly on my shoulder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the cold fingers tightened. Slowly, I turned my head, but there was no one there. I staggered back out of the compartment, my body shaking as I looked around frantically. The train was still there, silent and motionless on the tracks. I don't know where I am. The only light comes from the flickering light of the train window. I started walking along the length of the train, hoping to find some clue about where we had stopped. My footsteps crunched heavily on the gravel. Then, I heard a faint rustling noise behind me. Instinct told me to run, but I didn't know where to go. My only option was to go back inside. I couldn't stay out here, but the thought of stepping back into that strange train filled me with fear. Still, I had no other choice. Stepping inside, the air felt heavier, more stifling than before. The dim lights flickered weakly, casting shadows over the empty seats. In the distance, near the end of the train car, there was a figure sitting motionless, head bowed, just like the girl Jan I had met. I knew I shouldn't approach, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me toward her. I called out, my voice trembling, Jan? I stopped a few feet away, staring at the figure. Her hair hung limply over her face, wet and dripping, as if she had just emerged from a pool of water. I stepped closer, intending to touch her, calling Jan again. She didn't respond. Then, she finally moved. She slowly turned her head toward me, her movements unnaturally stiff, jerking like a robot. My breath caught in my throat as her face came into view. Her eyes, once dark and intense, were now completely empty, like black voids staring right through me. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips curled into that same strange smile as before. There was a faint hissing sound, perhaps coming from her. Before I could react, she stood up, her body rising off the ground, floating. Her feet no longer touched the floor. She hovered just above it, her long hair flowing in the air. I was frozen in place, horrified as Jan's form began to change, her body stretching and distorting. It was something I had never seen in real life. A voice echoed through the train car, coming from everywhere, surrounding me.
Why did you come back? Why are you here?
My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. I needed to get out and leave. But when I turned to run, I felt something cold and invisible pressing against my chest. I moved like a puppet, being forced back into the seat. The lights flickered violently, casting wild, shaking shadows as if the train had come alive. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. Silence filled the air. I looked up, and there was Jan, floating, her long, translucent fingers reaching toward my face. She told me to come with her, that I could never leave. The cold radiated from her, seeping into my bones, freezing me. Her fingers brushed against my skin, and in that moment, I was no longer on the train. I was floating in an empty void, with nothing but the sound of my own panicked breathing. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. I was trapped. Then, from the darkness, I saw them other figures, floating, drifting. Their forms were distorted, their faces obscured, and their eyes were empty. I couldn't breathe. Was this what happened to the missing passengers? Had they been brought here, into this void, to become part of this nightmare? And was I next? Suddenly, with a violent jerk, I was thrown back into reality. I was in my seat again, gasping for breath, drenched in cold sweat. Jan was gone. The train began to slow down, the familiar sound of the tracks returning. Finally, the train stopped at the station. The doors slid open, revealing an empty platform bathed in dim, flickering light. I staggered off the train, my legs weak and unsteady after what had happened. The doors closed, and as I turned back to look, the train began to move again, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't know if it was truly over. I stood there for a long time, staring into the void where the train had vanished. Haunting delivery trip. I was working for a food delivery platform on weekends to make some extra money. Between my main job and this side gig, I often felt exhausted. It was past 9 p.m. when I started my shift, picking up small orders and delivering them to random houses. After my first delivery, I drove around the area for a while, waiting for something to come through. 20 minutes passed with nothing. Just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed with an order for just 1 tacos and a drink. I confirmed the order and headed to the restaurant to pick it up. After grabbing the order, I began the 10-minute drive to the customer's house. It was a normal neighborhood, nothing unusual. As I approached a red light, I noticed a pickup truck stop next to me. Instinctively, I glanced over. The guy in the truck was leaning out of the window, staring straight at my car. I looked away when the light turned green and pressed the gas. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The truck was now in my lane, driving a short distance behind me. As I approached the neighborhood where I was making the delivery, the truck was still behind me. Was he following me? The route was mostly straight, so I wasn't sure if he was just heading in the same direction. I tried to stay calm, but the moment I turned into the neighborhood, I knew. The pickup truck turned in too. Maybe he lived here, I thought. I continued driving through the quiet suburban streets, following the GPS until I reached the final road, a dead end. I braked and parked on the side of the road near the house number I had to deliver to. The truck followed and parked behind me. I sat there, frozen, trying to come up with a plan for the worst-case scenario. What was this guy doing? Was he really following me? I glanced at my phone and saw a message from the customer asking, "When will the food arrive?" Could it be? The guy in the truck? Was he the customer waiting for me to step out? I felt more trapped than ever. The man got out of the truck. My heart pounded as I watched him slowly approach my car. He stopped right by my trunk, his face partially hidden in the shadows. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed something like a metal rod and slammed it into my rear windshield. The glass shattered around me. I screamed and, without thinking, instinctively slammed my foot on the gas. The man jumped onto the back of my car, nearly lying flat as he tried to crawl through the shattered window. I swerved sharply, making a U-turn, and felt him fall off the car. My hands trembled as I maneuvered between the trucks. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumbling in the street as I sped away. My hands shaking, I picked up the phone to call the police. By the time the police arrived, the man had vanished. All they found were shards of glass scattered across the road. They searched the area, but he was gone. I stood staring at the cracks in my shattered windshield, and memories of the terrifying experience replayed in my mind. I was lucky to have escaped, but deep down I still felt uneasy because he was still out there. Haunting delivery trip. It's been almost a month since that horrifying night. I haven't driven for the delivery app since then. Every time I think about driving, the echo of shattering glass floods my mind. I try to tell myself it was just an incident, that I was unlucky. There were no witnesses. The police reassured me they'd find him, saying it was probably just a disturbed person trying to scare me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be some reason he was following me. I decided to try driving again. I needed the money, and I couldn't let fear control my life. I told myself that this time I'd be careful and avoid driving too late at night, and I'd stay away from isolated neighborhoods. As I got into the car, that familiar fear washed over me. My hands were sweaty. I tried to close my eyes, take a deep breath, and turn the key in the ignition. Things started off fine. I was careful and checked my mirrors more frequently. But as the sun set, my phone buzzed with an order that sent a chill down my spine. 1 taco and a drink. A simple order, just like that night. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the accept button. I figured it was just a coincidence, so I accepted the order. A light drizzle had begun. The drive to Taco felt eerie, as if I was retracing the same steps as that night. I picked up the order and placed it on the passenger seat. As I drove to the delivery address, waves of anxiety hit me. The house was in a different neighborhood, but each turn felt strangely familiar. When I parked at the curb, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The headlights of a car behind me suddenly flicked on. I looked, it was a truck, and it looked just like the one from that night. Panic set in as the truck rolled closer, its blinding headlights on full beam. The truck parked right behind me, as if waiting for me to make a move. I tried to text my customer, but I was shaking so badly I couldn't type properly, wasting precious time. Suddenly, a notification popped up on my phone. Customer, when will my order arrive? I couldn't believe it and dropped my phone right then. It was happening again. Could he have been waiting for this moment to get revenge? I couldn't go through this again. I had to act. I pressed the gas, moving my car to another spot. The truck slowed down behind me, its headlights glaring blindingly in my rearview mirror, causing me to squint. Suddenly, the truck surged forward, crashing into the back of my car. The impact jerked me forward, my chest slamming into the steering wheel. Pain shot through my ribs as I gasped, trying to catch my breath. I pressed the gas harder, but the rain had made the road slick, so I had to maintain control to avoid crashing. Panic hit me as he pulled up alongside, rolled down his window, and gave me a sinister smile. Another slam. The back of my car crumpled, and I felt something wet trickling down my head. My head had been injured and was bleeding from the impact against the window when he rammed me again. I braked hard, dazed, my vision blurring from the blood running down my face and the sharp pain in my side. But I couldn't give up. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 for help. I could see his silhouette through the rain, stepping out of his truck. I refused to give up, flooring the gas and driving blindly. My car slammed into a tree. Desperate to survive, I fumbled for the door handle, trying to get out before he got too close. In the distance, I could hear him screaming angrily. I forced myself to run, sprinting toward the woods at the edge of the road. Suddenly, I tripped. My ankle twisted and sharp pain shot up my leg. I couldn't move. He was almost on top of me, his shadow looming as I tried to crawl toward the edge of the road. I turned to face him. He raised the crowbar high above his head, ready to strike, and I screamed. But then, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet rain. He froze, trying to run, but it was too late. The police used a taser and tackled him to the ground. He was finally caught. I fainted. The girl in the red dress. The house we moved into after my father's death wasn't anything special, just another old, quiet mansion in the suburbs, far removed from our old life. It had been abandoned for a while, and it was clear why the rent was suspiciously cheap. Overgrown grass and neglected old furniture gave it a forgotten feel. But to my mother, it was home. I was 20 years old, and I dealt with my grief in my own way. Not long after we moved in, I began noticing small things slowly emerging in the house. But the sounds of whispers, creaking noises made me uneasy and anxious living there. It started with scratching, soft, persistent, on the other side of my bathroom door. At first, I ignored it, hoping it was just my imagination. But night after night, the sound continued. Then came the knocking, sometimes at the front door, sometimes at the window. It always came around midnight, but no one could possibly be there. We kept the gate locked, and no one could enter the yard. Yet the knocking continued. I told my mother. She dismissed it, saying, "It's just an old house." But I knew the house wasn't just old, it was holding on to something. One night, I invited my friend Joe to stay over. We were sitting in my room talking about school when we heard voices coming from the kitchen. It was well past midnight. Everyone should have been asleep. Out of curiosity, we pressed our ears against the door. A conversation was happening just outside, but we couldn't make out a single word. We tiptoed into the hallway, but the kitchen was empty, dark, cold. We checked the entire house, nothing. Everyone was asleep. The voices were gone, leaving only a chilling silence. A few weeks later, my brother decided to test his luck. He and his friends thought it would be fun to play with a Ouija board in my room while I was away. They thought it was just a silly, superstitious game. At first, nothing happened. They laughed awkwardly, asking questions but receiving no response. Then one of them froze. His face turned pale, his body stiff like a statue. Without a word, he bolted from the room, his friends close behind, terror in their eyes. Once outside, the guy finally spoke. He had seen her, a girl, standing at the bathroom door, wearing a red dress, her hand on the knob, staring at them. He said she couldn't have been older than 13, and her eyes were filled with something he couldn't describe. Fear, anger, curiosity. When my brother told me this, I thought he was just trying to scare me. Of course, I didn't believe him. Why would I? I had never seen her, but the story haunted me, lodged deep in my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. Later, I had a birthday party at a friend's house. Jordan, a friend of mine, got drunk, so I took him to my room and told him to stay there until he sobered up. He collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep. Later, I went to check on him. The room was pitch black, with only a faint light coming from the bathroom. Jordan wasn't in bed. He was sitting at the bathroom door, one leg in, one leg out, talking to no one. I tapped his shoulder. He jumped, then looked at me, confused. He glanced back at the bathroom, then at me again. He mumbled, "I thought I was talking to you, but I just laughed it off, thinking he was too drunk." The next day, he explained, I was teasing him, but he was dead serious. In his drunken state, He had seen a girl in the bathroom. She was wearing a red dress, standing in the middle of the bathroom, asking why he was there. And when I walked in, she disappeared. It didn't stop there. The hauntings, the knocking, the voices continued. My fear grew as one by one. People close to me began talking about an entity that I had never seen in this house. I left my room and went to talk to my mother. While we were on vacation, my aunt and uncle stayed at the house. When we returned, they were sleeping on the living room floor, terror etched across their faces. They said the shower in my room kept turning on by itself, and the radio too, making it impossible for them to stay inside. My mother had no choice but to confront the landlady, who initially denied everything. But the truth came out. The landlady's mother had lived in this house as a teenager with her twin sister, who had ended her life in the bathroom wearing a red dress. It was all true. The red dress, the girl, the spirit trapped within the walls of our home. I didn't know how I was going to convince my mother to leave, but since we were struggling financially, it was piling up. So I had no choice but to stay in the house a little longer. The girl in the red dress. The days that followed were tense, filled with a thick sense of unease that blanketed the house. My mother decided we should move out and find a new place to live. However, things weren't settled yet, and we faced difficulties. So we had to stay in the house a little longer to figure things out. That was our last night in the house. I couldn't sleep. The woman in the red dress kept lingering, haunting my mind. I lay in bed, wrestling with these thoughts until I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see the house one last time. I got out of bed and walked through the dark hallway. I headed to the bathroom, where it all began. As I reached the bathroom, a chill filled the air, heavy with tension. I hesitated at the doorway, feeling something preventing me from turning on the light. I stepped inside, the cold tiles pressing against my feet, and then I felt another presence in the room. Fear gripped me tightly. Her presence was so strong, I could feel her breath on the back of my neck. I didn't dare turn around, didn't dare move. As I stood in the darkness of the bathroom, a cold hand rested on my shoulder, and a flood of images of the girl in the red dress filled my mind. It was as if she was showing me her story. Buried for decades, the girl, now known to me as Maria, had lived in this house long ago. She was intelligent and talented, but her life was full of suffering because her twin sister was always more favored for her beauty. Everything about Maria seemed overshadowed by her sister. As the years passed, she felt trapped in her own home, living in her sister's shadow, who seemed to have everything Maria longed for. The breaking point came when her sister fell in love with a man. They planned to marry, with their parents' blessing. But Maria, who had quietly loved the same man, was devastated. Even her own chance at happiness was taken from her. Unable to bear the pain, Maria spent much of her time in the small bathroom. It became her sanctuary, the only place where she could escape the suffocating presence of her sister, and the life she felt was never meant for her. One night, overwhelmed by sorrow and loneliness, she made a tragic decision. She thought that leaving this world would make things better, and she ended her life in that very bathroom. Her sister, consumed by guilt, left the house in grief, but Maria's spirit remained bound to the house, trapped in the place where she had taken her own life. As the images faded, I understood the profound despair of Maria. Her spirit had lingered all these years, waiting for someone to recognize her pain. But now, as I stood there in the bathroom, I felt a strange connection with her. The sorrow that had once filled the room was replaced with an intense urge to help her find peace. I whispered, trembling, calling Maria's name. I told her, "I understand what you've been through. You don't deserve to be so alone. I'll leave, and you don't need to stay here anymore." It's time to let go and find peace. In that moment, the cold hand on my shoulder lifted. The oppressive air slowly began to ease. For the first time since we moved in, it felt as if the house itself had released its hold on her after all this time. That night, I slept in my bed without fear, no knocking, scratching, or voices. Everything had disappeared. Perhaps she had finally left, freeing herself from the chains she had once forged. The next morning, as we packed the last of our belongings into the car, I looked back at the house one last time. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the old, stately mansion. As we drove away, I felt that Maria had found the peace she longed for. The house was just a house now, no longer haunted by the sorrow of the past. And though I know I will never return, I will always remember Maria, the poor girl in the red dress, who finally found the freedom she had been denied in life. The haunting of Route 23. I've been doing this job for over 20 years, driving on long, desolate highways at all hours. As a truck driver, I've gotten used to isolation, to the silence of the road. As a truck driver, I've also had to get used to sometimes sleeping in dangerous places. I was driving along Route 23, a road known for its long, deserted stretches. It's a 30-mile stretch of highway surrounded by endless rows of trees and dark tunnels. I had been driving for 3 hours, and I usually stop for a break after 4. I didn't particularly like this road, but I had no other choice. I spotted a small parking lot up ahead, a flat patch of land nestled between the trees. It was just big enough for my truck. I turned in and parked there. The dense trees surrounded me with a sense of desolation and silence. I stepped outside to brush my teeth. While brushing, I heard the sound of an engine echoing in the distance. A car was approaching, but instead of passing by, it slowly crept closer. Its windows were dark, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something wasn't right. I hurried back to the safety of my truck, slamming the door shut. I wrapped the seatbelt around the handle, an old trucker's trick, to make it harder for anyone to open the door from the outside. I had done this many times before in dangerous places, but tonight, it felt necessary. I pulled the curtain shut and lay down on the bed in the back of the truck, covering myself with the blanket. But the fatigue from the long drive soon took over, and within minutes, I was fast asleep. It felt like I had just closed my eyes when a noise woke me up. It was footsteps, soft and slow, circling the truck. Then they stopped right outside the driver's door. Then came a loud, violent knock on the door. I jolted up, almost falling out of bed. The knocking on the door grew more frantic, more aggressive. My hands fumbled as I tried to shove my shoes on. I shouted, "Who's out there?" But there was no answer, just the banging getting louder. I rushed to the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I shoved the key into the ignition. The truck roared to life. I pulled the curtain aside, ready to drive off. And that's when I saw him. A man, dressed all in black, stood just inches from the truck. He held a large knife in one hand and a hammer in the other. We locked eyes, and he twisted his face into a grotesque, maniacal grin. He seemed unhinged. Then he lifted the knife in front of me, as if taunting and provoking me. My truck suddenly stalled. I hit the horn, warning him I would charge if he didn't back off. But instead of retreating, the man started walking toward me. He quickened his pace. Then he started sprinting toward me, yelling as he ran. The knife and hammer swung wildly in his hands as he charged at the truck. I realized my window was still cracked open. I reached to close it, but before I could, his face was pressed against the glass. His wild eyes stared into mine. He grinned, nodding toward the window. With a sudden swing, the hammer smashed against the driver's side window. The glass shook but held. My hands trembled as I tried to restart the engine. Another swing. This time, The glass shattered. A third swing. Cracks spiderwebbed across the window. It was about to give completely. My life hung by a thread. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas just as the window opened. The man screamed as the truck lunged forward, throwing him off balance. His hammer was still lodged in the broken window as I sped away. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stand up. He stood in the middle of the road, watching as I drove away. His silhouette was clearly visible in the mirror. I haven't driven like that since. That night taught me to always be prepared, to plan my route down to the smallest detail. Now, I sleep in safer places, far from empty parking lots.